In 1735, a ship called the Göteborg departed from the harbor at Gothenburg, Sweden, loaded with silver. Its destination was Canton, China, and its mission was simple: bring back tea. The voyage would take over a year each way, navigating through pirate-infested waters around the southern tip of Africa and across the Indian Ocean. Entire crews died of scurvy, shipwreck, and disease on these journeys, and they did it all for dried leaves. That sounds insane, but the fact that people risked everything, bankrupted nations, started wars, and literally redrew the map of the world over a plant you can buy for $3 at any grocery store today tells you something. Tea is not just a drink, it never was. So how did a wild shrub growing in the mountains of southwestern China become the most consumed beverage on the planet after water? How did it topple dynasties, fuel revolutions, and reshape global trade for centuries? This story starts almost 5,000 years ago in a place most people have never heard of: Yunnan Province, China. Around 2700 BC, according to Chinese legend, Emperor Shen Nung was sitting beneath a wild tea tree while his servants boiled water for him to drink. A few leaves blew off the branches overhead and drifted into the pot. Shen Nung, who was known as a herbalist and a curious experimenter, decided to taste the accidental brew rather than dump it out. He liked it a lot. Now that story is almost certainly a myth. Shen Nung himself may not have been a real person in the way we think of historical figures, but the core of the legend lines up with what archaeologists and botanists have confirmed. The Camellia sinensis plant, the single species that produces all tea, green tea, black tea, white tea, oolong, all of it, originated in the Yunnan region of southwestern China. People in that area were chewing tea leaves and brewing primitive versions of the drink thousands of years before anyone in Europe knew the plant existed. For centuries, tea was primarily medicine. Chinese texts from the Han Dynasty, around 200 BC, reference tea as a treatment for everything from headaches to digestive issues to fatigue. People ground the leaves into pastes, pressed them into bricks, and boiled chunks of those bricks in water with salt, ginger, and sometimes onion. If you ordered that version of tea at a coffee shop today, you would probably spit it out. The transformation from a bitter medicinal brew to something people actually enjoy drinking for pleasure happened slowly over hundreds of years. But the real turning point came during the Tang Dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 AD. This is where a man named Lu Yu enters the picture. Lu Yu was an orphan raised by Buddhist monks who became obsessed with tea, not just drinking it, but studying it. He spent years traveling across China, visiting tea-growing regions, documenting preparation methods, and cataloging different water sources. In 760 AD, he published a book called the Cha Jing, or the Classic of Tea. This was the first known book in human history entirely about tea. The Classic of Tea covered everything: how to grow it, how to process the leaves, what kind of water produces the best flavor, and what vessels to brew it in. Lu Yu turned tea from a casual folk remedy into an art form with rules, techniques, and philosophy behind it. The Tang Dynasty emperor was so impressed that tea became a taxable commodity for the first time. The government realized that if everyone was drinking this stuff, they could make a fortune regulating it, and they did. But here is where tea's story gets bigger than China. Buddhist monks had been drinking tea for centuries to stay alert during long meditation sessions. As Buddhism spread along trade routes into Korea and Japan, the monks brought tea with them. In Japan, tea arrived around the 8th century. A Buddhist monk named Aichu is credited with serving tea to Emperor Saga in 815 AD, and the emperor liked it so much that he ordered tea plants to be cultivated near the capital. But Japanese tea culture really exploded a few hundred years later when another monk named Eisai brought powdered green tea, matcha, back from China in 1101. Eisai wrote his own book about tea's health benefits and promoted it to the samurai warrior class as a way to stay focused and disciplined. The samurai loved it, and over the next few centuries, the Japanese tea ceremony, known as chanoyu, evolved into one of the most refined cultural rituals in human history. A 16th century tea master named Senno Rikyu codified the ceremony into its most celebrated form, emphasizing 4 principles: harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Every movement, every gesture, and every placement of the cup had meaning. The tea room itself was deliberately small, sometimes only 4.5 tatami mats, roughly 81 square feet, forcing even the most powerful warlords to bow low upon entering. Rank and status were left at the door. The ceremony was about presence, respect, and finding beauty in simplicity. Meanwhile, back in China, tea culture kept evolving. The Tang Dynasty, which lasted from 960 to 1279, shifted from boiled brick tea to whisked powdered tea, and then during the Ming Dynasty, starting in 1368, loose-leaf tea became the standard. People started steeping whole leaves in hot water, which is basically how most of the world drinks tea today. By this point, tea was flowing along the Silk Road and maritime trade routes into Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually reaching the edges of Europe. Traders in places like Samarkand and Istanbul were buying and selling Chinese tea alongside silk, spices, and precious metals. But Europeans themselves were late to the party. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to encounter tea through their trading posts in Macau in the early 1500s, but they treated it as a curiosity, not a commodity. The Dutch were the ones who saw the business opportunity. By 1610, Dutch traders were importing tea from China and Japan into Amsterdam, and within a few decades, tea drinking had spread among wealthy European elites. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In 1662, King Charles II of England married a Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza. Catherine was already a devoted tea drinker. She brought her tea habit with her to the English court, and suddenly drinking tea became fashionable among the English aristocracy. If the Queen was doing it, everyone wanted to do it. Within a generation, tea went from an exotic foreign novelty to the national drink of England. Tea houses popped up across London. The British East India Company, which had been focused on spices and textiles, realized that tea was about to become their most profitable product. And that profit motive is where this story turns dark. The British East India Company had a problem. China was the only source of tea in the world, and China did not want British goods in return. The Chinese emperor famously told King George III that China possessed all things and had no use for British manufactures. The trade was entirely one-directional. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to pay for tea, and the imbalance was becoming a national crisis. So Britain found something China did want: opium. British traders, operating through the East India Company, began growing opium poppies in India and smuggling massive quantities into China. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese people were addicted to opium, and the social devastation was catastrophic. When the Chinese government tried to crack down and destroyed over 20,000 chests of British opium in Canton Harbor in 1839, Britain used it as a pretext for war. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. Britain won decisively, forced China to open 5 ports to foreign trade, and seized Hong Kong. The Second Opium War followed from 1856 to 1860 with similar results. All of this, the wars, the addiction crisis, the colonial seizure of territory, was driven in large part by Britain's desperate need to keep the tea flowing without bankrupting itself. But the British had another plan running simultaneously. They wanted to break China's monopoly on tea production entirely. In 1848, the East India Company hired a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune and sent him on what might be the most consequential act of corporate espionage in history. Fortune shaved his head, grew out a braided queue, dressed in traditional Chinese clothing, and traveled with 2 Chinese servants who helped him pass as a mandarin from a distant province. He journeyed deep into the closely guarded tea-growing regions of Fujian and the Wuyi Mountains, areas where foreigners were strictly forbidden. Fortune did not just grab a few plants and run. He spent months studying how tea was processed, learning the secrets of oxidation, firing, and rolling that the Chinese had perfected over centuries and guarded fiercely. He collected over 20,000 tea seedlings and approximately 17,000 germinated seeds. He packed them into specially designed glass cases called Wardian cases that kept the plants alive during long ocean voyages. He also recruited 8 Chinese tea experts, men who understood the processing techniques the British had tried and failed to replicate on their own, and convinced them to relocate to India. Fortune brought everything to the Darjeeling region in the foothills of the Himalayas, where elevations reached 7,000 feet and the cool mist provides ideal growing conditions. He also sent plants to the Assam region in northeastern India, where a wild variety of tea plant had already been discovered growing naturally in 1823. Within 20 years, Indian tea production exploded. British-owned plantations in Assam, Darjeeling, and later Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, were producing enough tea to supply the entire British Empire. China's centuries-old monopoly on tea was broken. The cost was enormous, and not for the British. Plantation labor in India and Ceylon was brutal. Workers, many of them Tamil migrants brought to Ceylon from southern India, worked grueling hours for almost nothing. Entire communities were uprooted and transplanted to serve the tea industry. The conditions on many plantations were closer to forced labor than free employment, and the social scars from that era persist in those regions to this day. While the British were reshaping the global tea trade through colonialism and corporate espionage, tea was playing a very different role on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. By the 1770s, American colonists were drinking enormous quantities of tea. It was their most popular non-alcoholic beverage. But the British Parliament had imposed a series of taxes on the colonies, including the Tea Act of 1773, which gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America and included a tax the colonists had no say in approving. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists in Boston, some disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. That is roughly 92,000 pounds of tea, worth about $1.7 million in today's money. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, was one of the defining acts of defiance that led directly to the American Revolution. In a very real sense, tea helped create the United States, and it also explains why Americans drink so much coffee. After the Boston Tea Party, drinking tea became associated with British loyalty. Patriots switched to coffee as an act of political identity. That cultural shift stuck, and to this day, the United States remains one of the few Western nations where coffee dominates over tea. Back in Britain and its empire, tea culture was only accelerating. The afternoon tea tradition, often credited to Anna Russell, the Duchess of Bedford, around 1840, became a fixture of British social life. The story goes that the Duchess felt a sinking feeling of hunger between lunch and dinner, which was served fashionably late, around 8 or 9 at night. She started requesting a tray of tea with bread, butter, and cake in the late afternoon. She began inviting friends, and the custom spread rapidly through the upper classes. Afternoon tea became a daily ritual for millions of British people across all social classes within a few decades. Factory workers in Manchester drank strong black tea with milk and sugar. Lords and ladies in country estates drank it from fine china. Tea was the great equalizer in a deeply unequal society. The Industrial Revolution turbocharged tea consumption even further. Tea was cheap. It provided caffeine to keep factory workers alert during grueling shifts, and the boiling water required to brew it killed bacteria that made untreated water dangerous to drink. Some historians argue that tea literally made the Industrial Revolution possible by keeping workers alive and productive. By the late 1800s, tea was the lifeblood of the British Empire. It was grown in India and Ceylon, shipped on British vessels, traded through British ports, and consumed in British homes at a rate of roughly 6 pounds per person per year. The shipping itself became a spectacle. In the 1850s and 60s, the great tea clipper ships raced each other from China to London, competing to deliver the first cargo of the new season's tea. The fastest ship earned a premium price. The most famous race in 1866 saw 5 clippers leave Fuzhou on the same day and arrive in London 99 days later, with the taping beating the Ariel by just 20 minutes after a 14,000-mile voyage. Crowds gathered at the docks to watch the ships arrive. Newspapers covered the races like sporting events. Tea had become entertainment. Then came the 20th century, and tea started changing again. In 1904, at the World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri, a tea merchant named Richard Blackenden had a problem. He was trying to sell hot tea to fairgoers, but the summer heat was brutal and nobody wanted a steaming cup of anything, so he dumped ice into the tea and served it cold. Iced tea was born. Today, roughly 80% of tea consumed in the United States is iced, and it remains one of America's most popular beverages despite the country's overall preference for coffee. Around the same time, the tea bag was making its entrance. In 1908, a New York tea merchant named Thomas Sullivan started sending tea samples to customers in small silk pouches. The customers, not realizing they were supposed to empty the tea out, just dunked the whole pouch in hot water. It worked. Sullivan switched to cheaper gauze bags, and the tea bag industry was born. Tea purists, especially in China and Japan, still look at tea bags the way Italian chefs look at canned spaghetti sauce. But for the average consumer, tea bags made brewing a cup almost effortless, and that convenience drove consumption to record levels worldwide. The 20th century also saw tea culture evolve and diversify around the globe. In India, chai became the national drink, a spiced tea brewed with milk, sugar, cardamom, ginger, and sometimes cloves and cinnamon. Chai wallas, street vendors selling freshly brewed chai, became as iconic to Indian cities as hot dog stands are to New York. In Morocco, mint tea became a cornerstone of hospitality. Refusing a cup of mint tea in a Moroccan home is considered deeply impolite. The tea is poured from a great height to create a frothy top, and it is served 3 times, each cup representing a different value. In Turkey, tea replaced coffee as the national drink in the early 20th century, after the Ottoman Empire lost control of coffee-producing regions. Turkish tea, called say, is brewed incredibly strong in a double-stacked teapot and served in small tulip-shaped glasses. Turkey now consumes more tea per person than any other country on earth, over 6.5 pounds per person per year. In Tibet, in the Himalayan regions, butter tea, made by churning tea with yak butter and salt, has been a caloric staple for centuries. At elevations above 14,000 feet, where farming is limited and the cold is extreme, butter tea provides essential fat, calories, and hydration. And then there is the matcha explosion. For centuries, matcha was a niche product, reserved mainly for Japanese tea ceremonies and Buddhist monasteries. But starting around 2010, matcha went global. Matcha lattes started appearing in coffee shops across the United States and Europe. Health food stores marketed matcha as a superfood loaded with antioxidants. Instagram lit up with photos of bright green matcha drinks, matcha ice cream, and matcha pastries. By 2020, the global matcha market was worth nearly $4 billion and growing fast. A ceremonial tradition that Buddhist monks had practiced for over 800 years had become a wellness trend on social media. Today, tea is produced in more than 50 countries on every habitable continent. China remains the world's largest producer, followed by India, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Turkey. Global tea production exceeds 6.5 million tons per year, and over 2 billion people drink it daily. That is nearly a quarter of the human population starting their morning the same way. The scale of modern tea production is staggering. In Kenya, tea is the single largest export crop and employs more than 3 million people. In Assam, India, there are over 800 tea estates covering roughly 770,000 acres. The tea industry generates over $200 billion annually worldwide. And every single leaf of that tea, whether it is a high-altitude Darjeeling first flush picked at dawn by hand or a commodity-grade tea bag manufactured by machine, comes from the same plant species, Camellia sinensis. The only differences are in how the leaves are processed after picking. Green tea is heated quickly to prevent oxidation. Black tea is fully oxidized. Oolong falls somewhere in between. White tea is the least processed of all. One plant, thousands of variations, 5,000 years of history. Tea started as an accident, a few leaves blowing into a pot of boiling water in the mountains of Yunnan. It became a medicine, then a luxury, then a tool of empire, then a catalyst for revolution, then an everyday ritual for billions of people. The cup you brew tomorrow morning connects you to Tang Dynasty scholars debating the ideal water temperature, to Japanese samurai perfecting the art of presence, and to British soldiers in the trenches of World War I brewing tea under artillery fire, because that is what you do when the world is falling apart. You make tea. During both World Wars, the British government considered tea so essential to morale that it was one of the first items rationed to guarantee supply. Winston Churchill himself reportedly said that tea was more important to his soldiers than ammunition. The wars that were fought over this leaf, the espionage that was committed to control it, and the labor that was exploited to produce it, all of that history lives inside something most people treat as completely ordinary. Tea is never just tea. It never was. If this story changed the way you look at the simple leaves in your cupboard, please subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the history that they tried to bury, one cup at a time. Join us as we brew the future. The next treasure of history will be poured soon.